As I'm going through the books that I read in 2016, I haven't been really thinking about what was going on in my life at that time. But this book reminds me exactly how everything was faring at those times. I read The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion in 2016. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and I wrote this about it after finishing. I'm thankful and appreciative for the purpose in this book, even though I couldn't connect 100% with its content. That points to what actually becomes the big takeaway for me here. Grief is important and different for everyone. There are common threads in its emotion, but the way they are experienced, and more importantly, the way that they are dealt with, is varied. I can appreciate that this was terribly difficult to write, and likely terribly important for Didion. I'm not sure that I need to write to get in touch with my own grief, but I need to do something. This is her diary for the year following her husband's death. There are a number of heartbreaking moments and thought-provoking assertions that may help light a candle for you. I felt objective. I felt outside her situation, watching from somewhere else. Maybe that's an indication of my reluctance to work through my own feelings on the matter. I like this book, but I feel like it's hers. I came to it wanting to get in touch with something for me. I'm finishing it with a renewed call for my own action, and that's possibly a best-case scenario for me with it. So yeah, this is all about grief. It was a really tough time in my life in 2016. My dad had suddenly passed away in 2012. We were taking care of my mother, who needed 24-hour care, up until her death in 2017. So there was a whole lot of grief going on during this period, and I'm sure that I was struggling with it. I'm sure that I still struggle with it now. The book was recommended to me in a way to connect with grief. And I think the way that I describe it here, thinking about it as a great outlet for Joan, is definitely how I felt about it. I felt on the outside, which is what I mentioned in the review. I felt that I was observing her, processing her grief. It was a tough thing for me to understand grief in my life. My dad's sudden death in 2012 was so sudden that we didn't have anything planned. It was the last thing that I thought, that my dad would die before my mom, because my mom was sick. And so when my dad died, and I immediately had to take care of my mom, there wasn't really time for grief. There was so much work to do to give my mom the care she needed. Those 5 years between those periods were probably about processing grief, but much more about hanging on for dear life. My points here about grief and how it worked for Joan to process this by writing are really well taken. And I think journal writing is something that's a really valuable experience for most people. It isn't exactly what I needed, and I don't know if I know what I needed, but the way that I've learned about grief today, and talking about this review in 2024, is to be open, to let it happen the way it's going to happen for you. Those 5 years were loaded with some of the most difficult things in my life. The death of both my parents, my divorce, I broke my leg, recovering from so many wild things and so many life-changing events, negative life-changing events. I think was an instruction period, was a training program for how to force myself to be open to grieve and to feel through all of the feelings that come up with it. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready through a lot of this, and I had to do things. I was really focused on action. My definition of grief now is to do the opposite of action. Not worry about what you're doing, but just being open to what you're feeling. One thing that I would like to say about grief for everyone, and for everyone who has someone in their life that is grieving, is to be patient with it. The thing that I mentioned here about how dealing with grief is varied for everyone is something that even after these years that I'm talking about here for me, and experiencing the way others feel grief in the years after, I think it's really true that everyone experiences it differently, and everyone has different time periods. There are some things that happen that you may never get done grieving, that you may have to process for the rest of your life, and that's okay. However grief works for you is okay. For me, it comes up from time to time, and I feel it from time to time, but life continues, and new things happen. I didn't write. I read this, and I think it was helpful. I think this is what taught me to be open to what comes, and I did move forward. And my life is better today than it was then. Again, kudos to Joan for tapping into what she needed to talk about how she was processing her husband's death. I would recommend it for anyone who is struggling to understand their own grief, and to help them allow whatever comes in, that it's going to be okay, and that you're going to figure it out whenever you figure it out. The Year of Magical Thinking, a diary about grief by Joan Didion. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars.